Alright, the 80s was a horrible time for performance cars. The 80s was a carryover of the fuel crisis of the 1970s, and a lot of cars in the 80s were geared towards fuel economy versus performance. There was a lot of diesel cars in the 80s, a lot of cars getting 40 to 50 miles per gallon, but performance-wise, cars suffered. One of my favorite cars of all time, the DeLorean, is also one of the biggest disappointments of my childhood. I was a kid. I was a kid in the 80s. I was a high school and junior high kid in the 90s. So when I found out the DeLorean had 130 horsepower, it was heartbreaking, man. It was a big disappointment to find out the DeLorean had as much power as a Corolla of my era of the 90s, Corolla of the 90s. I always thought the DeLorean was an exotic car. I'm a big fan of Back to the Future, but I didn't like the DeLorean because of Back to the Future. I actually saw a DeLorean one day on the freeway, and I always thought it was an exotic-looking car, so I assumed it was powerful. That's when I was younger and didn't know much about cars, and I grew up a little bit and started doing research on car performance, and I got a book and found out that DeLorean had 130 horsepower, and big disappointment. But you know what? That was the times. The Corvette in '84, C4 Corvette, the first year of the C4 Corvette, it had 205 horsepower. The ZR1 came out in the early 90s. ZR1 Corvette had 385 horsepower, later 405. But the base model Corvette didn't get 300 horsepower until 1992. I have a few cars here from Auto Trader, a few ads up. I'm trying to get as close to $5,000 as possible. Found a C4 Corvette with the LT1, $7,000. This is when Corvettes got 300 horsepower. The 90s is a nice time. You could get like a 300 horsepower V6 Camaro, V6 Mustang. I believe the Challenger is 290 now. The Hyundai Genesis is 300 horsepower. But hey, you got to spend more than $25,000 to get a new car these days. The beauty of the 90s is a lot of cars were 300 horsepower back then. The horsepower started coming up again in the 90s. So you could get a lot of good deals and get a car that was 300 horsepower back in the day. 300 horsepower in the 90s. That was a big deal. Top of the line cars were like Vipers and Lamborghini Diablo, ZR1 Corvettes. They were 400 horsepower and over. But 300 horsepower was a big deal. 300 horsepower Corvette right here. Then you had the Dodge Stealth, pretty pricey, $10,000. Dodge Stealth and Mitsubishi 3000 GT with the turbo had 300 horsepower. The thing I didn't like about these cars, same thing applies to the Mustang and the Camaro. There was a lesser version. Like the lesser version of this car had like 220 horsepower. Then the top of the line had like 300. And that's what I always liked about the Corvettes. The base model, the quote-unquote worst Corvette had 300 horsepower, 92 and over. Lots of great cars in the 90s. 1994 Nissan 300ZX Turbo. I think this is a better car than the 350Z. I think the worst thing a car company could do is take a step back. This car is actually faster than the 350Z. Another 300 horsepower car, $7,000. I mean, I think that's awesome. Like I said, you could buy a brand new V6 Mustang or Camaro, Genesis. They all have 300 horsepower, but like I said, you're spending $25,000. Not all of us have $25,000 to burn, so it's cool to go back in time, and 300 horsepower is still a lot of fun. And then we have the Z28 right here, 98 Z28, just arrived. This is going to go fast. Someone's going to snatch this up quick. That's a great deal, and it's a manual. In 93, that's when the Camaro and Firebird V8s got 285 horsepower. Then in 97, what's 97 or 98, they got 305. Then the SS got 320. So yeah, 300 horsepower. The thing is, cars back then were lighter too. Like a Camaro's like 3,800 pounds now. With the V6, it's 3,800 pounds, 300 horsepower. The Camaro of the 90s was more like 3,400 pounds. It had 300 horsepower, but more torque than the V6s. of the current times, and they sound better too. You know, the V6s now, made now, they're powerful, but you can't replicate the sound of a V8. These cars will never sound bad. You know, 50 years from now, these cars are going to still sound badass. So those are a few cars from the 90s that had 300 horsepower. Now it's like in the 2000s, you know, a lot of cars have like 250 horsepower and up, and then the V8s now have like 400 horsepower. But, you know, it's a lot of money, and, you know, it's a new Camaro SS cost now. It's, you know, new Camaro SS is 30 grand and over, so go back in time a little bit, you can get a car from the 90s and get 300 horsepower for a lot cheaper. And 300 horsepower, that kind of power, you'll have a 13 to low 14 second car. So it's fun, man. For daily driving, it's fun. Next video, I'm going to do a walk around of my 300 horsepower, $5,000 find, my 97 Cobra. You know, I feel very lucky to actually find that. You know, it was reduced. Like, I saw an ad for it, it was like 6,700, then it was reduced to like 5,500, and then it was finally reduced to 4,800. So, you know, I was really happy finding a car with 300 horsepower for like less than 5 grand. So they exist out there. All these cars are dealer finds. You could probably find a cheaper example if it's private party. I just tend to look at dealers because a lot of times they offer a warranty, and you don't want to buy a car that's going to break down on you, and then, you know, you're shit out of luck and you got to pay out of pocket. If you get it from a dealer and they offer a warranty, you know, there's some security there. But those 300 horsepower finds for like 5 grand, they exist. Just got to look hard and get a little lucky. So next video, walk around of my 97 Cobra, and I'm going to talk about what I actually got for 5 grand, you know, a little under 5 grand. It's been a great car to me. Alright everyone, kick ass, be safe, and take it easy.